Things I did in Malbisi was to make this radio program. So it was just, it was like a podcast, which is why I'm so glad you're doing this. I think these conversations are the best way to communicate what we do as researchers, bits of what we've found out. Not everyone is going to read a paper, and the way in which we write academic papers isn't for a general audience. So I think definitely what people appreciated in Malbisi was me sitting down and talking to someone about my research, and then them being able to have a recording of it that they can play on the radio, and hopefully at some point I will go back there and do that again once the thesis is written. I was going to ask you how you would sum up fieldwork. If you just had a few sentences to describe that anthropology fieldwork experience.
I think that it is trying to understand big issues such as, like cultural values, society, social dynamics and social conflicts through small things.
You've just reminded me of what somebody told me in Timor. I think it came from another anthropologist, but there was a sort of a small group of researchers there at the time who I talked to. So I can't remember whose phrase it was, but they described, doing anthropology as collecting the little stories in order to tell the big story.
Yes.
And I think that's what you're trying to say. You're talking about the small things and the big things.
I give you two examples that come to my mind. We observe and we register the fact that the man sits at the table and he has, the best plate. He's the one with the best, and we try to understand. And we try, and you explain, patrilinearity by giving that detail. Or, for example, you sit in the kitchen with women and they gossip all the time, and you try to understand how and why gossip creates bonds between them, which is something universal. You don't have to go to Timor to understand, to know that gossip creates bonds between people. But it's precisely what is interesting is precisely the fact that universally people sit around the fire and tell stories, gossips, or whatever. I'm particularly interested about gossips because
yeah, it was like with jokes in my field site. I got really interested in trying to understand sort of the humor and the sarcasm, and there was also this joke that was really, really relevant to my fieldwork because people would always joke about people in the mountains where it was cold having more children precisely because it was cold, and it was quite an embarrassing joke that people made. There would always be so much laughter and a little bit of embarrassment and this sort of behavior around it. And this joke used to frustrate me so much because I couldn't ask a question about children without hearing this joke. And it actually led me to a really interesting part of my thesis, which is analysing this joke, but then also trying to understand what role people believe the environment plays in their fertility and reproduction and the different things that are in the landscape, like sacred places, sacred houses, ancestral spirits. So just, through this joke that in the beginning seemed, really frustrating, it comes to help me to tell a bigger story about people's reflections on the landscape and their survival. Jokes, gossip, drinking coffee, it's all the small things.
Yeah, the small things, exactly. Who keeps the rice? At some point I was interested in understanding who was keeping the rice. How do you say that? The uncooked one.
Yeah, the rice grain.
Yeah, the rice grain.
Yeah.
And I realized that had a lot of importance. That was the moment when I started to realize that agriculture, economics, and the political sphere were all together, and somehow they were related to the Umaluli, to the origin houses.
Interesting, and such a good question to ask. Who keeps the rice?
And I realized that because there was a fight, let's say a silent fight, between my host and his older brother, who was the one keeping the rice, because somehow we were borrowing. Well, the family that was hosting me, they were borrowing the rice from the older brother. And then I think that the older brother was pissed off because I was paying the rent to the younger brother.
And this is what all of those relationships are about, those entanglements and like your position within them. And so it teaches you so much that you thought you wouldn't know.
Yes, exactly. And that is why it's so important, to be there. You're not just an extra, because sometimes people say to me, well, but if you're there, you're gonna, people are gonna change because you're there. But then the only way you have to try and understand the context is, of course, being there. And at some point you realize that being there, your presence is actually what makes the field work exist.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting way to think about it. The fact that because you're there, the field work exists. I think that's a really nice quote. And those small things which add up to that bigger narrative, right? So you and I both know that when we talk about these little stories that we're telling one another now from our field sites, at the time they might have seemed so mundane or difficult to understand or required a lot of thinking about, why was this important? What was interesting about it? But I know, having read some of your chapters, that these things tell, a much, much more important story about, as you said, the relationships, the economics, the sacred houses, and what that does in Baucau.